The courtroom was quiet enough to hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Papers shuffled. A clerk cleared her throat. And then, almost too softly to catch a defendant, uttered the words that seemed to freeze the air. "I can't pay." It wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant. It was whispered like a confession, like a surrender. A simple traffic fine had turned into a mountain. And here in this tiny courtroom sat a person crushed beneath it. The words carried the weight of unpaid bills, of empty cupboards, of long nights staring at ceilings, wondering how to stretch one paycheck across a dozen obligations. Everyone in the room heard it, and everyone knew what usually came next. The system didn't care. A judge would remind the defendant of the rules, the obligation to the state, the punishment for non-compliance. Cold, bureaucratic machinery, rolling forward without a pause for humanity. All eyes turned toward the bench. Judge Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on the man before him. His silence wasn't dismissive. It was deliberate. His face didn't harden into stone as so many expected. Instead, lines of thought and empathy traced across his expression. He was weighing something more profound than the cost of a ticket. He was considering the cost of dignity. In that suspended moment, could almost feel the tension between two forces, the unforgiving rigidity of law and the fragile truth of human struggle. The defendant's voice trembled with shame, but Caprio's eyes held no scorn. They held recognition. Recognition of every immigrant father who'd worked 3 jobs, every single mother who had counted coins at the grocery checkout, every worker who had carried the weight of being one accident or illness away from collapse. Then came the pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The clerk waited, the gallery leaned forward, even the defendant seemed to brace himself for the hammer to fall. But it didn't. Not in the way anyone expected. Because what happened next didn't just change the courtroom, captured the hearts of millions. But to understand why this moment hit so deeply, you need to see what led up to it. Asterisk, for most people, a traffic ticket is an annoyancy slip of paper tucked under the windshield wiper, a reminder to slow down, a fee that eventually disappears from the bank account. But for others, it's the crack in a dam already straining under pressure. A fine of $50 or $100 may as well be $1,000 when the fridge is half empty and rent is already late. In these cases, a traffic violation isn't just about broken rules on the road. It becomes a test of survival. That's the hidden truth behind so many courtrooms in America. They aren't merely venues for justice. They are pressure cookers where poverty and bureaucracy collide. The system does not ask if someone is caring for a sick parent, or if their car is the only way to get to work, or if choosing between groceries and fines is a daily calculation. The system only asks, did you pay? Yes or no. And most of the time, that's where the story ends. The law has no patience for excuses, no space for compassion. The scales tip heavily in favor of the institution, leaving the individual to stumble beneath its weight. This imbalance isn't accidental, it's structural. A machine designed to keep rolling, no matter who gets crushed beneath its gears. Everyday citizens come into these rooms carrying more than just their cases. They carry histories of inequality. They carry the stories of immigrant families who built lives out of scraps, only to be fined for missing a deadline. They carry the dignity of parents who can't bear the thought of telling their children there won't be enough. This week, because the state demanded more, and in that silence after the words, "I can't pay," the imbalance is on full display. One struggling voice on one side, a vast, impersonal system on the other. It's David and Goliath, but without the sling. Without someone to step in, the outcome feels predetermined. But Judge Caprio was never known as a man who treated his courtroom like a conveyor belt. He listened, he questioned, he leaned into the lives of the people before him rather than away from them. He had a reputation, whispered from one end of Providence to the other, as the judge who cared. For some, that made him a hero. For others, it made him a threat to the proper order of things. Critics said his compassion blurred the line between mercy and indulgence. Admirers said it drew the line between humanity and cruelty. And so, on this day, the question wasn't only about one defendant and one unpaid fine. It was about the character of justice itself. Could a judge rewrite the expectations of a rigid system? Could empathy sit on the bench beside the law without undermining it? The gallery didn't know it yet, but the answer was about to unfold in real time. A turning point was coming, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of this small courtroom. Because when Frank Caprio finally opened his mouth to respond, he wasn't just going to pass judgment. He was going to ignite a conversation across the country. Asterisk. If you want to understand the magnitude of what Judge Caprio was up against, you have to see the real antagonist. It wasn't the defendant in front of him. It wasn't even the prosecutor. The villain here was bigger, faceless, and far more intimidating. It was the system itself, a machine built out of statutes and schedules, designed to process cases like clockwork without asking who those cases belong to. In theory, the courts are supposed to be temples of justice. In practice, too often they resemble factories. Defendants file in, one after another, clutching their summons like fragile tickets to a theater of shame. They stand before a bench, not as people with lives and struggles, but as case numbers. The language is cold, the judgment swift. The law speaks with authority, but rarely with empathy. For those with money, the process is irritating but manageable. Pay the fine, move on. But for the poor, the same fine becomes a crushing burden. When they falter under it, the system doesn't bend, doubles down. Miss a payment? Additional fees? Fail to appear in court? A warrant. Fall too far behind? Jail time. It's a cycle that punishes poverty itself. It's treating desperation as defiance. Picture a young single mother, working 2 jobs, pulled over for a broken taillight. The ticket costs more than her week's groceries. She can't pay on time, so late fees pile up. A judge in another courtroom tells her the law is the law and orders her license suspended. Now she can't drive to work. She loses her job. She falls behind on rent. All from one ticket that snowballed into catastrophe. The courtroom didn't just punish her, it dismantled her life, or take the story of an elderly veteran living on a fixed income. Fined for parking in a restricted zone he barely understood. When he explains he can't afford the penalty, the judge cuts him off mid-sentence, declaring, "Excuses won't be tolerated." The gavel comes down. Case closed. But for the man, the case is anything but closed. His pride is wounded, his limited savings drained, his sense of dignity shredded by a system that equates poverty with irresponsibility. These stories are not rare exceptions. They are the rule in countless courts across America. The rigid framework of the law treats everyone equally on paper. But in reality, equality without context becomes cruelty. To fine a millionaire and a janitor, the same amount is not fairness, yet the machinery of the system spins on, indifferent to the human wreckage it leaves behind. This cold indifference is its own kind of arrogance. It assumes that people who can't pay simply don't care, that hardship is just laziness in disguise. It assumes that justice is served when the book is followed to the letter, regardless of the lives being written between its lines. And so, courtroom after courtroom becomes a stage where ordinary people are humiliated, where their pleas fall on deaf ears, where dignity is trampled beneath legal formalities. Asterisk judges too often absorb the system's arrogance. They hide behind the phrase, "My hands are tied," delivering punishments without ever questioning the moral cost. For them, mercy is weakness, compassion is bias, and efficiency is the highest virtue. The gallery watches, the defendants leave in despair, and the cycle continues unbroken. This was the culture Judge Caprio inherited when he first donned the robe. A culture that prized procedure over people. A culture that would rather see a struggling family go hungry than bend the rules of a fine. A culture where the law's cold letter eclipsed the warmth of its spirit. And yet, inside that culture, there stood one man who refused to be just another cog in the machine. Judge Caprio didn't see defendants as case numbers. He saw them as neighbors, as parents, as workers who carried invisible battles into his courtroom. Where the system expected him to humiliate, he chose to listen. Where it demanded punishment, he often sought perspective. Asterisk, this defiance of tradition. This refusal to let bureaucracy override humanity is what made him controversial and what made his courtroom so different. He was not blind to the flaws of the law, nor naive about its necessity. But he understood something too many others forgot. The law was written for people, not against them. And that is why, when a man stood in his courtroom and whispered, "I can't pay," the moment was destined to be more than routine. This courtroom wasn't just another day in the system. It was about to become the stage for a lesson in humanity. To understand why Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom became so different, you have to go back to the beginning, to the streets of Providence, Rhode Island, where he was born, the son of Italian immigrants. His father was a milkman, waking before dawn to make deliveries across the city, hauling heavy bottles in the biting New England cold. His mother held the household together, teaching her children the values that had carried their family across the Atlantic: hard work, dignity, and compassion for others who struggled. Frank grew up watching his parents labor without complaint, seeing firsthand how sacrifice was woven into the immigrant's story. They didn't have much, but they gave what they could, not just to their own family, but to their neighbors. Meals were shared. Struggles were communal. Success was never measured in wealth, but in how you treated those who had less. These early lessons didn't just shape his character, they became the compass by which he would later navigate the law. Unlike many who ascend to the bench, Caprio didn't come from privilege or political dynasties. His rise wasn't paved by power brokers pulling strings. He earned it the hard way, by working, studying, and refusing to forget where he came from. After graduating from Providence College, he went on to Suffolk University Law School in Boston, often holding down jobs to make ends meet. It was the kind of path that built resilience. The kind that made you carry not just your books, but your family's hopes on your shoulders. When he returned to Providence to begin practicing law, he never cloistered himself in ivory towers. He stayed close to the people. He coached youth sports, mentored students, and built a reputation as a man whose word mattered as much off the record as on it. His community saw him not as a figure perched above them, but as one of their own, someone who had walked the same streets, faced the same hardships, and understood the silent weight of survival. That authenticity followed him into public service. When he eventually became chief judge of the Providence Municipal Court, he carried with him not just legal knowledge, but the memory of every working class neighbor who had scraped together coins to pay bills. He knew that justice, if applied without compassion, could easily become another weapon against the very people it claimed to serve. And so he built his philosophy on a radical idea: the law should listen before it punishes. In a world of courtrooms where defendants were treated like nuisances, Caprio's bench became something different. He looked people in the eye. He asked questions not to trip them up, but to understand them. If a mother explained she couldn't pay because she was feeding her children, he didn't hear an excuse. He heard a priority. If a veteran stumbled through an explanation of why his circumstances had unraveled, Caprio leaned forward, not back. He wanted to hear the story behind the ticket. It wasn't that he abandoned the law. He respected it deeply. But he believed that law without humanity was empty. Justice in his eyes wasn't just about statutes. It was about dignity. He once remarked that the job of a judge was not simply to punish wrongdoing, but to balance accountability with understanding. To him, every defendant wasn't a criminal by default. They were citizens carrying burdens. And sometimes those burdens explained more than a violation ever could. This approach made him both beloved and controversial. Clips from his courtroom began to spread online, showing him laughing with defendants, offering kind words, even forgiving fines when circumstances called for it. Millions watched, astonished that a judge could embody warmth instead of cold authority. Admirers called him America's nicest judge. Critics, however, grumbled that he was too lenient, that compassion had no place in the mechanical gears of justice. But Caprio didn't measure his work by applause or critique. He measured it by the people who left his courtroom with their dignity intact, by the single mother who walked out knowing someone had listened, by the elderly man who felt respected rather than dismissed, by the immigrant family who realized that America still had room for mercy. Over the years, these moments accumulated, each one reinforcing his belief that fairness wasn't about blindfolds, it was about vision. The vision to see the whole human being standing before you, not just the infraction on paper. And that's what made him uniquely equipped for the moment when a defendant beaten down by life whispered those three loaded words, "I can't pay." Caprio wasn't just a judge bound by codes. He was the son of immigrants who had lived the reality of scarcity. He was the neighbor who had coached kids whose families scraped by. He was the man who had built his career not on power plays but on respect for the common person. And yet, even with his reputation, no one could have predicted how he would respond to these three simple words. "I can't pay." The words hung in the air like a fragile echo. "I can't pay." The defendant stood small before the bench, shoulders hunched as though trying to fold himself into invisibility. His voice had been barely above a whisper, but its weight had landed on every ear in the courtroom. He stared down at his shoes, avoiding eye contact, as though shame itself were on trial. The clerk, stone-faced and efficient, shuffled papers with a snap of irritation. "Your Honor, the fine has already been delayed twice. Payment is overdue." The words were clipped, bureaucratic, and merciless. To the clerk, this was another case in a long line, nothing more. The law had been broken, the penalty was clear, and there was no space in the ledger for stories of struggle. The prosecutor leaned in, voice sharp with finality. "With respect, Your Honor, the statute is clear. Rules are rules. If we make exceptions here, we undermine the entire process." It was the voice of the system, echoing the cold doctrine that had humiliated countless others before. The defendant finally lifted his eyes. And what the gallery saw was not defiance but desperation. His face flushed with embarrassment, his words stumbled out unevenly. I'm not saying I won't pay. I don't have it. Not right now." His hands trembled slightly as he tried to explain. "I'm taking care of my mother. She's sick. I'm behind on rent. I've been picking up shifts, but it's never enough." Each sentence was a plea, not for absolution, but for understanding. The silence that followed was suffocating. People in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at the defendant with pity, others with the weary recognition of having been in that very position. But everyone was waiting for the same thing, the gavel to drop, the fine to be ordered, the routine to continue. Judge Caprio didn't move immediately. He sat with his hands folded, listening not only to the words but to the weight behind them. His gaze never wavered from the defendant, but his silence was unnerving. It wasn't the silence of indifference, it was the silence of deliberation. Every second that ticked by made the tension rise higher. The clerk cleared her throat again, breaking the stillness. "Your Honor, with respect, the record shows this is not the first time. If we let this slide, what kind of message are we sending?" Her tone carried the impatience of someone who had already decided the outcome. The prosecutor chimed in once more, pressing the point home. "The law does not account for personal circumstances. The responsibility lies with the defendant. If he cannot pay, consequences must follow." The gallery's collective breath grew shallow. Compassion or law? Mercy or procedure? This was the clash everyone felt, but no one voiced. In this room, those two forces had always seemed irreconcilable. The defendant swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "I'm not trying to get away with anything. I just don't know what else to do. I can't pull money out of thin air." His words echoed against the wood-paneled walls, raw and unpolished, the voice of a man trapped between pride and desperation. Judge Caprio finally leaned forward. The subtle movement drew every eye in the room. He rested his hands on the bench, his expression unreadable but intent. The silence deepened, almost unbearable, as though the entire courtroom were holding its breath. What would it be this time? Another cold recitation of the law? Another reminder that the system bends for no one? The defendant lowered his eyes again, bracing himself for the inevitable. The clerk adjusted her stack of papers. The prosecutor folded his arms, certain of the outcome, and then, with one sentence, Judge Caprio turned the entire room upside down. The room was still, not quiet still. It was the kind of silence that presses down on the chest, heavy and unrelenting, as though the very air itself were waiting. All eyes were fixed on Judge Frank Caprio. The defendant, a man nearly breaking under the weight of his own words, stared at the floor. The prosecutor sat with arms folded, the law on his side. The clerk held her papers like a shield, eyes darting toward the bench, waiting for the hammer to fall, and then Caprio spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it cut through the tension with the sharpness of a blade. "You say you can't pay," he said slowly, letting each word hang before continuing. "And I believe you." The defendant's head snapped up, eyes widening. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the clerk blinked, stunned at the admission. Judges weren't supposed to say that. Judges weren't supposed to acknowledge the humanity behind the docket. But Caprio was not a typical judge. He leaned forward, folding his hands, his gaze steady. "The law tells me I must impose this fine," he continued. "But justice—" He paused, letting the weight of the word linger. "Justice tells me I must also listen to the story behind it." It was the first crack in the armor of the system. You could feel the shift in the room, the rigid certainty of rules giving way to something deeper. The prosecutor cleared his throat, attempting to salvage control. "Your Honor, with respect, compassion does not erase responsibility. The statute is clear." His words rang with authority, but there was a nervous edge creeping in. Like a soldier realizing the battle was no longer on familiar ground, Caprio didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the defendant. "Tell me," he said softly, "how much can you pay?" The man's voice shook. Maybe $10. Maybe." His shame was palpable. $10 was nothing against the hundreds he owed, and yet to him, it was everything. A murmur rippled through the room. Some chuckled softly in disbelief. Others shifted, uncomfortable, sensing the vulnerability laid bare. The clerk frowned, pen poised as though she might scribble a protest onto the record. Caprio let the silence linger. Then, with deliberate calm, he delivered the blow that would echo far beyond those walls. "Then $10 it is." The words were simple, but in their simplicity, they carried a thunderclap of meaning. Gasps erupted. A woman in the back pressed a hand to her mouth. Someone else shook their head in disbelief. The prosecutor sat frozen, his arguments dissolving into nothing. The defendant blinked rapidly, as though trying to confirm he'd heard correctly. Caprio didn't stop there. He leaned back, voice firm but warm. "Justice is not about punishing people for being poor. It is about fairness. You've shown me your honesty. You've shown me your effort. And that matters more to me than the balance on a ledger." Tears welled in the defendant's eyes. His lips parted, but no words came. Gratitude was fighting through a lifetime of shame, struggling to take shape. The gallery, once restless, now sat in hushed reverence. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a revelation. For the first time, perhaps, many in that room felt the system bend and not break, but bend in the direction of mercy. And then, just as the weight of relief seemed too much for the man to bear, Caprio added one more twist. "Tell you what," he said, a faint smile softening his stern demeanor. "I'll make you a partner in justice. You'll pay your $10. And I'll match it with 10 of my own." The room erupted. Gasps gave way to applause. The clerk lowered her pen, shoulders sinking in resignation. The prosecutor leaned back, defeated, a faint smirk of disbelief tugging at his lips. And the defendant, he simply broke. Tears streamed down his face as he covered his eyes, overcome by a kindness he had not expected, could not have even imagined. This wasn't law. This wasn't mercy in the abstract. This was dignity, given shape and voice. The narrator's voice would have cut in here, measured and resonant. It wasn't just a legal ruling. It was a declaration dignity matters, that a person's worth cannot be measured in dollars, and that justice without compassion is not justice at all. The moment had the feel of theater, but it was no performance. It was real, so real it stung. People whispered about how rare it was to see humanity triumph over bureaucracy, and some blinked back their own tears. Ashamed at how low their expectations had been for the system they lived under, for the defendant, it was more than relief. It was vindication. For once, He wasn't treated as a number in a file, a burden on the court, or a case to be processed. He was a man, a son, a caretaker, a worker struggling to survive, and his dignity had been recognized. Judge Caprio's gavel tapped lightly, not as a hammer of finality, but as a punctuation mark. Case closed, he said simply. The rigid machinery of the system had just been turned upside down, not with rebellion or defiance, but with $10 and an act of shared humanity. The prosecutor sat back, silent. The clerk shuffled her papers more slowly now, her efficiency disarmed by compassion, and the gallery, as they filed out, carried with them the undeniable memory of what they had just witnessed in the weeks to come. That ruling would travel far beyond the courtroom. Clips would circulate, replayed over and over, the trembling words, the decisive pause, the thunderbolt of empathy. Commentators would dissect it, strangers would share it, families would sit around dinner tables and talk about it, but in that moment, before the cameras, before the headlines, it was just a room full of people who had been reminded of something rare and profound, that mercy could live inside the law, and that a single sentence from a single man could change the way others saw justice. The defendant, still wiping his tears, whispered a shaky, "Thank you." "Your Honor?" Caprio nodded once, firm yet kind. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank yourself for your honesty." That's what justice responds to. The man left the courtroom lighter than he had entered, not because the fine had been erased, but because his dignity had been affirmed. And as the doors closed behind him, one truth lingered in the air, unshakable. The system had rules, but humanity had power. The narrator's voice would return for the final beat of the act. The system, rigid and unyielding, crumbled in the face of human empathy. And for everyone watching, it was clear this story was no longer about a fine. It was about the meaning of justice itself. But the story didn't end in that courtroom. It was just beginning. Asterisk, the courtroom lights dimmed, but the echoes of Judge Caprio's words were only just beginning their journey. Within hours, the clip found its way onto phones, tablets, and television screens across the country. A shaky recording uploaded by a spectator spread like wildfire. The caption was simple, almost understated. He said $10 was enough. Judge Caprio changed everything. By the next morning, social media was ablaze. Twitter feeds stacked high with hashtags. Hashtag #ICAntPay, hashtag Judge Caprio, and the more defiant hashtag Justice with Mercy. TikTok stitched and remixed the moment in every conceivable way. Some creators replayed the silence before his ruling like it was the drop in a hit song. Others added swelling orchestral scores, transforming a municipal courtroom into a cinematic stage. Late-night comedians couldn't resist either. On one show, the host leaned into the camera and said with mock sternness, "Judge Caprio, I also can't pay. My Netflix password keeps getting shared." The audience roared with laughter. But beneath the joke lay an undeniable truth. Caprio had become a cultural figure overnight. Asterisk news networks framed it differently, of course. Conservative pundits shook their heads, warning that softness in the courts would lead to chaos. Progressive commentators, however, hailed it as a model of compassionate justice. One viral headline declared, "In $10, a judge redefines America's promise." Celebrities joined the fray. A-list actors tweeted their admiration, posting clips of the ruling with captions like, "This is the America my parents came to," and finally, "A judge who gets it." Musicians sampled the line. Then, $10 it is, turning it into a refrain that pulsed through dance beats in packed clubs. Politicians, never ones to miss a cultural wave, tried to ride the surge. Some praised Caprio as proof that the system could still honor its people. Others scoffed, framing it as sentimental grandstanding. But no matter the interpretation, the reach was undeniable. Millions had seen it. Millions were talking about it. A municipal courtroom in Providence had suddenly become the center of a national debate about justice, poverty, and dignity. For the public, the story crystallized into something bigger than a single man's hardship. It became a symbol. The hashtags weren't just about fines anymore. They were declarations of identity and solidarity. Under hashtag #ICAntPay, thousands shared their own stories, the mother juggling 3 jobs to cover rent, the immigrant taxi driver ticketed for parking where he could afford to, the student crushed by fees and debt, each post built on the last. A collective cry that the system had failed ordinary people for far too long. Judge Caprio, knowingly, had given those voices a stage. His courtroom decision was no longer confined to the individual in front of him. It had cracked open a conversation about justice itself. The praise, of course, was met with backlash. Critics argued he had undermined the law, setting a dangerous precedent. What happens? One senator sneered on live television when everyone says they can't pay. Do we just abolish responsibility altogether? His words echoed in certain circles. But they struggled to drown out the tidal wave of support that had already surged across the country. Still, the debate only amplified Caprio's stature. He wasn't just a municipal judge anymore. He had become a cultural icon. A symbol of what justice could look like if it dared to feel. To some, he was a hero. To others, a radical. But no one could ignore him. The image of that moment, a trembling man whispering, "I can't pay," and a judge replying with quiet mercy, replayed endlessly, printing itself into the national imagination. It wasn't policy. It wasn't reform. It was a story, and stories had a way of surviving where statutes and speeches did not. And yet, as powerful as the hashtags, headlines, and late-night punchlines became, there was something far more important stirring beneath the noise. Something quieter, but infinitely more lasting. Because beyond the memes and the headlines, something far more important happened. Step back for a moment. Forget the courtroom walls, the polished benches, the murmurs of clerks and prosecutors. What happened that day was bigger than a parking fine, bigger than a man's inability to pay. It was a reminder, a declaration that justice without compassion isn't justice at all for too long. The system has been painted in stark black and white. Laws on one side, punishment on the other. You break a rule, you pay a price. Simple, efficient. But life has never been simple. Human struggle does not fit neatly into statutes and codes. People don't live in the margins of rule books. They live in apartments where the rent is late. In hospitals where medicine costs more than groceries. In jobs where paychecks vanish before the week is done. And that's why Judge Caprio's decision landed like thunder. It wasn't about bending the law until it broke. It was about reminding us that the law exists for people, not the other way around. That every statute, every ordinance, every fine at its core is meant to serve a society, and society only thrives when it remembers its humanity. Compassion is not weakness. It's the highest form of strength. It takes no courage to wield a gavel and declare punishment, but it takes enormous courage to pause, to listen, to see the person behind the violation, and to say, your dignity matters more than your debt. That is not weakness. That is leadership. That is justice. And here's the truth that lingers long after the headlines fade. What Judge Caprio did was not extraordinary because it was grand. It was extraordinary because it was simple. He looked at a struggling man and chose to treat him like a human being, not a case number. Imagine for a moment, if every courtroom, every office, every institution did the same. How different would our country feel? How much stronger would our communities be? This moment challenges each of us to reflect. When we encounter someone saying, "I can't pay," whether it's money, time, or even emotional strength, how do we respond? Do we become the cold clerk, the unbending prosecutor? Or do we find a way, even in small gestures, to echo Judge Caprio's example and say, "I see you. I hear you." Let's find a way forward together, because justice isn't confined to the bench. It lives in every act of empathy we choose to extend, in every chance we take to value people over procedures, in every decision where we place dignity at the center. That is where real change begins, not with laws written on paper, but with compassion written in action. And so, this story is not just about a judge in Providence. It's about us. About the kind of society we choose to build. A society where mercy is not an exception, but a foundation. A society where the phrase "I can't pay" is not met with humiliation, but with understanding. That's why this moment didn't just belong to one judge or one courtroom. It belongs to all of us. Asterisk, I can't pay. 3 words, whispered in a trembling voice that could have been met with cold bureaucracy and routine punishment. Instead, they became a symbol. A symbol of dignity over despair, of humanity over indifference. In that moment, Judge Caprio reminded us all that compassion can rewrite the script, not just of a courtroom, but of a life. Because here's the truth. Cruelty is easy. Bureaucracy is easy. To look down from the bench and say rules are rules requires no imagination, no courage. But to lift your gaze, to hear the human being behind the violation, and to choose mercy, that is strength. That is justice. And that is the lesson that will outlive any fine or statute. So if this moment moved you, don't let it end when the video does. Share it. Share it because someone out there feels unseen, unheard, unworthy, and they need to know that dignity still matters. Share it because justice is not about papers and penalties, but about people. And if you believe that kindness is not weakness, but the greatest power we hold, then join us. Subscribe and stand with voices that prove compassion can change the world, one story at a time. As the courtroom buzzed with disbelief that day, Judge Caprio rose and walked away, not as a man who had bent the law, but as a man who had honored its truest purpose. The gavel rested, the people whispered, and yet, for all the noise, what lingered was silence. The silence of reflection, of hope, of possibility. Because sometimes the softest words echo the loudest. I can't pay.